Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. What you're about to see was one of the most complex homicide cases ever documented in Toronto. There was no eyewitness, no murder weapon, and only a mountain of circumstantial evidence that would have to be ferreted out, analyzed, and assembled. As to our Exhibit A, if I showed you, it would give it away. In an exclusive neighborhood on a quiet Remembrance Day, the lady of the house lies brutally murdered. The victim is Anna Lund, 67. A German emigre who came to Canada just after World War II with her husband, Joseph. Shortly after their arrival, the couple was blessed with a daughter named Elsa. Elsa grew up and did postgraduate work in England, where she had met and married an engineer named William Appleton. In fact, it is William Appleton who helps police establish the time of the murder. He tells police he was in the habit of fixing things for his mother-in-law. Last week, he fixed her sink. This week, he'd promised to put up a plate rail. He said he'd come by at 5:30. He knocked a few times, and getting no answer, he headed off to the hardware store to get materials for the job. When he came back, the police were there, and his mother-in-law was dead. The body was so bloodied and battered that Appleton is dissuaded from viewing it. We pick up the story with the investigators.
Just one of the things we looked at is there must have been a lot of hatred here, because all the injuries sustained were basically all to the head, save and except for the hands when she was trying to protect herself.
As with all suspected homicides, the body is sent to the coroner's office to be autopsied. A pathologist determines Anna has been struck at least 65 times, mostly around the head and face. But a routine X-ray of Anna's skull reveals something startling. Bullet wounds. Exhibit A, bullets recovered from the body. These are what actually killed Anna Lund. The reason the bullets hadn't been detected in the first place is that the killer had purposely beaten the victim around the bullet wounds. Why? To hide the fact that she'd been shot at all, because bullets can be traced. To understand how bullets can be traced, you need to know that commercial manufacturers cut spiral grooves into the inside of the barrel to stabilize the bullet, like a well-thrown football. The bullet, as it's fired, bites into these spiral grooves, leaving small striations known as rifling marks. These rifling marks, even from the same model of gun, are as unique as fingerprints. The reason a water tank is often used is that water doesn't affect rifling marks.
There's 3. So what I'd normally do is I would take my suspect projectile and I would examine it. I'd go all around the circumference of it, looking for gross marks. Then I would put my test projectile that I recovered from a suspect firearm on the right-hand stage, matched them up. First thing I'd look and I'd say, yes, the land and groove impressions are similar in size. They turn the same way and they're an equal amount. There's 5 on the suspect projectile, there's 5 on my test.
Sam examines the bullets that killed Anna Lunt and finds, well, see for yourself.
They were badly damaged, but when I examined them microscopically, there did not appear to be any rifling.
No striations, no rifling marks. Wait a minute, I thought that was impossible.
So if you had a smoothbore that had no rifling in it, or you had a homemade firearm that somebody had just drilled out and not put rifling in it, and consequently you would not have this individual rifling characteristics.
The people who make homemade guns don't go to the trouble of rifling the barrels. Therefore, no rifling marks and no way to identify the bullet. The murder had been extremely clever. So much for Exhibit A. With firearms stymied, the investigation shifted to other branches of forensic science. At most homicides, there is blood, an overwhelming amount of blood. Blood on the victim, blood from the victim, and blood on any discarded weapon. By studying the blood-stain pattern, a forensic biologist can determine the attack site, the likely position of the assailant, and the victim, as well as where the victim was beaten, shot, dragged, and the force and number of blows. The task of deciphering this gruesome hieroglyphic falls to Jonathan Newman, an expert in blood splatterings.
It was quite clearly a very violent and sort of sustained assault on the victim. There was a lot of spattered blood. Normally when somebody cuts their finger, and that will leave a stain of a particular size, usually quite large. What we see typically in a beating or a shooting is that the stains are much smaller than one would see from just merely drip blood. And that is because there has been a force or an impact applied to the wound, which has caused the blood to be broken up into relatively small droplets. So the general principle is that the greater the amount of force applied, the smaller the droplets that are produced. So there were some marks which were described as being smears, characteristic of movement through wet blood. So we'll just take a tissue paper and we'll make a smear. This is where 2 items have come into contact, and then we have a movement of that item. Now the first smear in the middle is quite heavy, and that's quite difficult for me to determine the direction. But the top smear and the bottom smear exhibit certain characteristics which may allow me to determine a directionality. It's difficult for an unaware or an uneducated viewer to separate out what pattern is related to what action.
Anna Lunt had been attacked right inside the front door. She had been bludgeoned until she was a helpless heap on the floor. Then, realizing they were visible from the street, the killer dragged the battered woman into the kitchen, where she was shot with a homemade gun. But how had the killer gotten into the house? Was it a break-in? Was Anna surprised from behind as she came home from shopping? Was the killer someone already inside the house? Or had Anna Lunt opened the door to the killer? An investigation of the crime scene can take up to 2 weeks and may require dozens of rolls of film. The simple reason? Once the evidence unit leaves the scene of a crime, they can never go back and hope to find it exactly the same. So the photo ident unit shoots first and asks questions later.
You have little pieces of a puzzle, and you start gathering all these little pieces of that puzzle. And It's like anything. If you have a box and you open up and you get the puzzle, you throw it onto a table and you say, well, what have I got here? Well, you have to start looking at every piece to see what it means and put it together. And by the time you put it together, you're going to get a picture. And that picture will tell you a story. And that's exactly what happened here.
Each piece by itself may not mean much, but combine the hundreds of pieces and a picture emerges. Police brought Joseph Lunt in to question him about some photos. The front door showed no signs of a break-in. Mr. Lunt described his wife as a creature of habit. For instance, his wife was fanatical about answering the door for anyone she wasn't expecting, even close relatives. This pretty much ruled out the fact that she might have opened the door to the murderer. Anna was also a stickler about her rugs. She always took off her shoes as soon as she came into the house and put on her slippers. So the fact that she was found wearing her slippers pretty much ruled out that someone had followed her home and pushed their way in. There was also a new roll of paper towels on the counter. Because of her experience in the war, Anna Lunt was extremely frugal. She would have never opened up a new roll as long as the existing one wasn't totally used up. This suggests that the killer had unwrapped the roll of towels. Anna Lunt kept her paper towels under the sink. How would the killer know where to look? The week before, William Appleton had fixed his mother-in-law's sink. Appleton claimed that he got no answer at his mother-in-law's. He headed off to the hardware store to get materials for the job, and then went to the liquor store to buy a bottle of vodka. To verify his story, Appleton had even volunteered to bring the police the empty vodka bottle. At the time, Detective Matanovic said it wasn't necessary. But now he asked Appleton to drop the bottle off at his office. But before going to the police station, Appleton stopped at a discount store and bought a plastic container, the kind you stored food in. Next, he stopped at a liquor store and bought a bottle of vodka. Then he drove around, all the while emptying the vodka bottle into the container on his lap. Only then did he drop off the vodka bottle at Matanovic's office. Appleton had been under surveillance the whole time.
Friday the 13th came to haunt him. This was the bottle that he purchased back on November the 11th, on Wednesday. He left the receipt in the bag, dated Friday the 13th.
It was time to examine Appleton's car, so it was brought to the forensic garage under the building.
In Appleton's car, we found a small amount of blood staining and some small tissue fragments in the area of the driver's door. In addition, in this case, there was some blood staining found in the trunk of the car. And that staining was in the area of the trunk opening, right near the edge.
When they tested the blood, it belonged to Anna Lunt. When the police bring Appleton in again for questioning, again he changes his story. Now he tells police that when he came by to put up the shelves at 5:30, the door was open. He entered and called out, then he heard moaning. He tried to save her. His first thought was to call the police, but then he panicked. Afraid police might think he was somehow implicated in his mother-in-law's murder. So he left, stashed his blood-stained clothes in the trunk of the car, and bought a new pair of jeans. When he came back to the house, the police were already there. Appleton's story that he panicked is what's known as reasonable explanation. It would explain away all the evidence against Appleton, the vodka bottle, the blood in his car, and his running away from the scene. But was he telling the truth? And what about these? Was it conceivable that he hated his mother-in-law enough to beat her to a pulp and shoot her point blank in the face with a homemade gun? By this time, the police knew something about Appleton's personal history. He had been born into a London working-class family. At 12, his father died and Appleton was forced to go to work. He was lucky enough to get a job in a machine shop as an apprentice and become a skilled machinist. He met and married Elsa Lunt in London, and after the couple moved to Canada, he'd found work at an aerospace firm where he had risen to become a supervisor. Almost everyone at his work and his neighborhood spoke about him with respect. Again, investigators turned to forensic science, this time to Ron Smith, a forensic accountant.
The forensic accountant is just one more witness who assists the court in determining whether or not the accused is innocent or guilty.
Smith established that despite earning good money as a supervisor at the aerospace firm, Appleton's financial position had been deteriorating over time.
The shaded area being the amount of credit that he has used, and the black area, that little piece of the pie, is the unused credit.
At the time of the murder, he had exhausted his credit limit and was maxed out on all his credit cards. He had about a month's reserve before he would have to put the family house up for sale. So the police had a possible motive: money. The Lunts had considerable money, and Elsa was their only child. In the event anything happened to them, Elsa would inherit it all. As evidence began pointing more to Appleton, Detective Matanovic had a new worry. He was concerned that if Appleton felt the police closing in on him, he might panic and hurt his wife or son. At this point, the investigation shifted to England.
There was three reasons why they were important to the investigation. Number one, we didn't know enough about the accused, and we wanted to find out everything we could about him because it's very important. Secondly, the item that we were looking at, the homemade firearm, we had to prove that the accused was capable and had knowledge to manufacture such an item. And the third reason, probably the most important reason, is I've never been to England, so I wanted to go.
Working in tandem with Scotland Yard, Matanovic discovered two important facts. Appleton's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. And as a lad, Appleton had apprenticed a machinist who had taught him how to build firearms. Meanwhile, detectives checked out Appleton's workstation. They found 3 hand-drawn diagrams.
I said they could well be rough drawings for a homemade firearm. I showed them a device similar. This particular one here, I'll show you. It's a cutaway, showing you the spring, and you can see how I can move it back. This I would refer to as the bolt. The part that is moving rearward when I pull this circular ring is the bolt. And it is just a solid, it does not have a firing pin as such. The whole works. The forward portion would act as a firing pin and would crush the rim, the entire rim of a cartridge case. Is threaded, and it threads into the rear portion or the body of the homemade firearm. Cartridge case is placed into the barrel portion here in the rear, and then it's threaded into the body of the firearm.
It certainly looks like a gun, but it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that.
I just let it go forward under spring tension, and it will discharge.
No rifling marks. Just like the bullets that had killed Anna Lunt.
I guess he probably looked at us as two dumb cops. That's probably what it boiled down to, and his arrogance was his downfall.
Appleton was arrested and charged with Anna Lunt's murder. Appleton's motive was money. He had intended to murder both in-laws and profit when his wife inherited. The plan had been foiled because Anna had told Joseph not to rush home for dinner. Appleton was going to put up shelves. As he lay in wait, Appleton had been spooked by a local newspaper delivery boy who thought it strange that the house was so quiet. Appleton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
At the beginning, you build up the evidence, you gather the evidence, you effect an arrest, you present the case to a judge and jury. The jury listens, and at the end, after all that evidence is heard, they come back with a verdict of guilty based on reasonable doubt. You get that satisfaction because you have done your part to do something for the deceased who could not speak for him or herself. And it provides closure for the family.
At the trial, the judge commended the whole investigative team, saying that if the police and forensic scientists had missed the significance of a few early clues, Anna Lunt's murder would have remained unsolved and her killer would have gone free.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. What does handwriting say about us? Is our handwriting as unique as fingerprints? Our first Exhibit A? This is all I can show you for now. Her name was Debbie. She was 30, a divorcee and ex-model with a memorable giggle. His name was Jeff. He was 26, a young Turk who'd quit school in the 8th grade and was now pulling down 150 Gs. It was the best of times. They both liked to powder their nose from the inside. Life in the fast lane was good. She worked in accounting. He sold used cars. And despite conventional wisdom about dating people you work with, they began to fall in love. Everyone knew. Everyone knew when Debbie and Jeff snuck off to Hawaii. Everyone knew that Martin Miller, the car jockey, babysat Debbie's dog. Everyone knew when Debbie and Jeff moved in together. Everyone knew when their relationship hit a speed bump. And everyone knew that Jeff was moving out that Saturday. According to Jeff, he arrived just after lunch. Nothing prepares him for what's inside. He attempts to revive her. As he waits for police, he gets another shock. Exhibit A, 3 words scrawled with what appears to be red lipstick. Who wrote them and why? Bob Strathdy, the detective who headed the investigation, picks up the story.
We don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know the cause of death. A few things we do know. The door was locked, and the door had not been forced open. Now, if that be the case, why would there appear to be a robbery? Why would this place be in a state of disarray? A lot of things didn't make sense initially. And then you start to examine more closely, and this disarray of the apartment, my partner and I reached the decision that this was staged. This wasn't a break-in or a robbery or a theft. But the apartment, it was our opinion the apartment was made to look that way.
The kitchen table suggests Debbie may have been in the midst of doing laundry. In fact, police find 3 machines full of wet clothes in the downstairs laundry room. But dominating their investigation is the mirror.
That at every homicide scene, the killer leaves something or the killer takes something away. And it was very true in this case. Can you use either of those parameters to help you lead you to the perpetrator? In this case, the killer had left a message on the mirror. Can we interpret that writing and apply that to a suspect?
An ident officer finds a tube of lipstick that may have been used on the mirror. It'll be tested for color and dusted for fingerprints. The bedroom is combed for clues. Back at the station house, Jeff is one of the first people detectives interview. He concedes strange things have been happening lately. People have been calling and hanging up. An Officer Hanson called the rental office and warned them not to lease an apartment to Jeff because he was a drug user. Jeff called the police. There is no Officer Hanson. Even though Debbie was with him for some of those times, he suspects she was behind it all. And that was one of the reasons he wanted to break up. Detectives ask how she had taken the breakup. Miserable, Jeff admits. The week before, she asked him if taking 8 sleeping pills was enough to kill herself. Another time, she told him if he left, she'd commit suicide. Maybe that's why she suddenly gave away her beloved dog to her mother just yesterday. Surely the police weren't thinking it was murder. He was concerned, he said, because of the mirror. The phrase, "Jeff, you're next," sounded like something Debbie would write. At least that's what he wanted to believe, because it was less scary. Had the dead woman written the message, then killed herself? To find out, we have to look into Exhibit A.
Now there's handwriting, cursive connected handwriting. How unique is it? Completely unique to yourself. We all have a uniqueness in our handwriting. We place our own trademarks on our handwriting. It's the product of all those years of practice that your brain now knows how to make every one of these letters, knows how to connect them, knows what proportions it likes to see. It's your artistic ability, your patterns that have been developed over such a long time that your brain automatically forces you to use over and over again.
Take an average classroom. Kids start to learn how to write trying to model the handwriting above the blackboard. But even after a very short time, when a teacher collects the papers, she can probably identify handwriting of each student without looking at the name. By the time we've graduated high school, our handwriting is basically set.
But what a question document examiner does in most circumstances is to, well, in the everyday nuts and bolts work, is to compare questioned writing with known handwriting specimens, making a physical comparison between these handwritings to determine whether they were written by the same person or whether they weren't written by the same person, just as important.
When the victim's handwriting was compared to the handwriting on the mirror, well, see for yourself. No match. But if the victim didn't write this, who did? Was it a suicide or was it murder? As with all questionable deaths, Debbie's body was transported to the morgue to be autopsied.
Dead bodies always tell stories, and one keeps one's options open until the autopsy and the findings are completed. There was an extremely fine amount of abrasion or scraping of the top layers of the skin across the front of the neck. And as the diagram shows, there are extensive areas of bruising on the back of this victim, and the obvious message at the end of the autopsy was that this woman didn't strangle herself.
McCall's conclusion is that the victim had been manually strangled from the rear, with the assailant possibly kneeling on her back as he choked her. Also, the victim may have been wearing a kerchief around her neck at the time of her death, and the assailant pulled it tight. But the way the body was found suggests something else.
The positioning of the body, the at-rest position, for lack of a better description, this isn't someone who hates this girl. This isn't your mad sexual predator that leaves a girl like this. So now as things are starting to add up, you're drawing a profile, for lack of a better word, of who is here. Somebody who doesn't really hate her, somebody who she probably let in, somebody who left his calling card with the note on the mirror. Things are starting to develop. We're a long way from identifying a suspect, but we're starting to get a profile.
The laboratory at the forensic center finds cocaine in the victim's blood, and a vaginal swab reveals semen. The police question Jeff again. He tells them that on that Friday night, he'd come over to finish packing. It had gotten late, and they had ended up making love. The morning of the murder, as he was about to pick up the moving van, Debbie begged him to let her do his laundry. He said she didn't have to. That was the last time he saw her alive. He swears he spent the rest of the morning getting the move together. Detective Strathy found out from the phone company that someone had called the victim from Montreal and spoken 42 seconds at 10:56 a.m. It was one of Jeff's car contacts, but he remembered the victim saying she planned to get really drunk that night at a place called Illusions. The plan had been to go with a couple of girlfriends and maybe Martin Miller, the car jockey. 2 days after the murder, Martin shows up for work wearing a cross he claims Debbie gave him for babysitting her dog when she went to Hawaii. But a co-worker remembers Debbie wearing the cross the week before.
Martin Miller gassed cars and he washed cars. That was his role. And he'd see her in the accounting department. And she, in fact, she was an attractive, nice lady. And Martin, I think, aspired to be in her company.
Miller claims he got teased about Debbie, but it was really nothing. Oh, he liked her, but she was too old for him. Too old to think of as a girlfriend. But you know, He liked her a heck of a lot. When the topic eases into his whereabouts on the day of the murder, Miller answers he drove around with a friend named Tony, and they caught breakfast at the Grenadier restaurant in the middle of High Park.
I happen to grow up in the West End, and I'm familiar with the Grenadier restaurant, and at that time it was seasonal, and I knew it not to be open at that time. And when he mentioned he was in the Grenadier restaurant with his friend, we pursued that as to the particulars of their visit to the restaurant.
But a liar does not a murderer make. So Strathy calls Tony to get his side of the alibi.
And he goes through the same story. Now, the particulars of what they did in the restaurant were light years apart, mainly because it didn't happen. And an interview of 30 to 45 minutes, we concluded it. And just before concluding it, my partner asked him, looked him in the eye and said, "Have you told us the truth?" And he started crying and he said, "No, I lied to you." He wanted to do the interview over again. We did. And he says Martin phoned him and told him to tell us that they were together that morning, but he wasn't with them.
Police get Tony to call Miller and tell him police want to talk to him. What should he do? Miller tells Tony not to sweat it. He brags about how the police bought everything he told them and how stupid they are. Of course, police were listening in. Miller still lives at home. During the interview with police, he shows them a photo of Debbie's dog, which Debbie supposedly gave him for dog sitting the time she and Jeff went to Hawaii. But it turns out Debbie's mother only gave her the photo on the Friday, and Jeff remembers seeing it there the Saturday of the murder. Meanwhile, a witness in the building claims to have seen Debbie in the elevator on that Saturday morning with a guy a head and a neck taller. When police question Miller, he starts squirming, saying he's experiencing haziness. Strathy asks Miller if it was possible he went to Debbie's that Saturday morning. His answers show a confused state of mind. Well, it could have been totally possible. Well, just to let myself to, okay, I can't get hold of her. I'll go and see if they're there. Well, can you? Can you help us then on that Saturday morning? I mean, we know you're an early riser. Yeah, sure. Right. We know you weren't with Tony. Oh, Jesus, come on, mind, think. In a dazed way, Miller eventually admits that, yeah, maybe he took the subway out there around 11. Maybe he helped her with her laundry. But then he left. The next interview is even more significant.
I felt assured that Martin did it, but why won't he tell me he did it? You know, things are piling up on Martin. What am I missing?
What's really impeding the case is that police lack any physical evidence. Right after the murder, Debbie's bedroom was combed for clues. A forensic ident officer had found palm prints on the wall at the head of the bed and lifted a right thumb print and a full right hand off the mirror. And at the base of the building had found a tube of lipstick.
The laser examination failed to detect any prints on the lipstick tube, and in regards to the mirror and the wall in the apartment, there were no identifiable fingerprints belonging to the victim, Jeff or Martin Miller.
The investigation seemed to be moving 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Given the lack of fingerprints and other evidence, police were thrust back on the mirror, the only piece of physical evidence that could put the suspect in the wrong place at the right time.
There's a natural quality to those writings. They don't have the stilted appearance of a disguised writing. Let's face it, if you or I were the murderer and wrote a message on a mirror, I think I'd use my weak hand, or I would do something. I'd write it upside down. I don't know, but I would hope that no one would ever be able to figure out who did it. But apparently the person who wrote on this mirror didn't take that into consideration, and I guess foremost in his mind was the message. I've got to get this message across, and he wrote it in his normal hand.
In this case, police suspected the writer's circumstance was standing, writing in lipstick in big print on a smooth surface, having just killed someone.
In particular, I was very much impressed or interested in this lowercase e in the word next. That e has a piece missing. Now, I would be really interested to find that same pattern in the letter E in the known specimens from this subject. If that existed, I would think that would be quite a telling and weighty factor.
The problem was that the known samples of Martin Miller's printing were in ballpoint pen. Hard to compare with 3 words in lipstick. So Strathdee has an idea. He called Miller's boss and asked him to get Miller to use a felt marker to make up some large signs for used cars.
Well, let's take a look at some of the writings that were presented to me as the known writings of the suspect in this case. Here's the word seat. Notice the top of the E in the word seat. It's missing its top. Here's an E in the word divided. The top is missing. Again, very obvious here that we have a 2-stroke R, the same exact situation as what is on the mirror. The O, with its joining at about 1 o'clock, and to a lesser degree, the U with the long tail. I believe with about 12 letters like this, the likelihood of someone else performing these motions would be about 1 in a 250 million.
Martin Miller certainly would not strike you as a classic killer. He's a very extremely polite fellow. He's extremely young psychologically. I believe he was 19 or 20 at the time of the event, but he was much younger psychologically. He had a great deal of respect, and you could maybe stretch that to love for the victim girl. This was his queen.
But on that Saturday morning, when Martin Miller went over to Debbie's and offered himself as a boyfriend replacement for Jeff, police surmised Debbie laughed in his face. That's when the warped part of him took over, and he strangled her. Due to a legal technicality, Miller's lawyer was able to plea bargain the sentence down to manslaughter. And Miller, for the first time, conceded he had killed Debbie Wright.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Paranoia is when you imagine a conspiracy against you when there isn't one. According to psychiatrist R.D. Lang, there's no word for someone who is being conspired against and doesn't know it. She thought it was a dream. Even when she couldn't find her camera the next day, she didn't give it a second thought. Which is why she never mentioned it to the next tenant who moved into the same apartment. a working student named Sue Levesque. So weeks later, when Sue Levesque is taking a shower and the shower curtain suddenly sucks in on her as if someone had opened the front door, she shrugs it off as just her imagination. Then her spare keys, which she always keeps on the stereo speaker, go missing. It's confusing because the chain lock was still on and the stick is still wedged in the balcony door. The super lives directly above her. When she goes home for Thanksgiving, she asks him to keep an eye on her place while she's away. When she returns, she's rattled that the super says he thought he heard someone in her apartment the day before. It wasn't her. Nothing is missing except the hockey stick normally wedged in the balcony door. She's tempted to call the police, but what would she say? Someone broke into my apartment and didn't take anything? Instead, she settles for the super making her a new stick. That night, she can't sleep trying to figure out what to do. The next morning, she puts a jar outside the door. If it's moved, she'll know someone was in her apartment. Then she sets off for work. Coming home that evening, she's spooked to find that the jar has been moved. Then she notices the bathroom door is closed. Living alone, she never closes it. Someone is in there. Someone she doesn't know. And they're dead. Words spill out of her mouth about a dead body in her bathroom. He tells her the victim is a teenage girl who babysits the super's son. He calls 911. It seems only seconds before the police and the ambulance arrive. Sue hears the commotion. She hears someone shouting something about resuscitation. Then she hears the victim's mother. Then she hears the mother's anguished scream. The victim is a 15-year-old who lives in the next building. Her name is Carol Ann Jennings. It breaks your heart. After the emergency crews leave, the ident unit goes in. The first thing they do is collect short-lived evidence. Any evidence that might be subject to changes in weather or might easily be contaminated. A soil sample just inside the door. A footprint on the balcony. And hairs and fibers.
If we can see it, then we're going to collect it. And in other words, if we can see a hair or a fiber, then we're going to very carefully collect that.
Hairs, fibers, footprints. These are all known as trace evidence. In this case, where there was no eyewitness, trace evidence was to be crucial. The ident unit will examine the footprints. The hairs and fibers will be sent to the forensics expert at the Center of Forensic Sciences.
We deal with the hairs one by one. We have to deal with them as individual hairs and individual fibers. and we subject them, each of these individual fibers, to a battery of tests.
It was lucky Jim Crocker was a patient man, because it would take months and months to examine and analyze all the trace evidence from this ugly murder. To further their investigation, police asked Sue Levesque to go through the apartment and tell them if she notices anything out of place. Of course, she tells them about the jar. That someone has rearranged her books. And that she's missing abroad. Meanwhile, the victim's body is sent to be autopsied.
External examination of the body showed a ligature mark across the front of the neck and mainly to the right-hand side of the neck, but crossing the midline to the left. In this particular case, the ligature was a brassiere. In association with the ligature mark, there were multiple areas of abrasion, meaning scraping of the top layers of skin. And it's not unusual in cases such as this that the victim will cause injury to the skin in an attempt to get the hands or the ligature off the neck. This woman was conscious and was fighting for her life as she was being strangled.
But what was she doing in Sue Levesque's apartment? Sue had found the chain lock just as she left it, and the stick still wedged perfectly in the sliding door. We pick up the story with the investigators.
So we found out that this the superintendent of the building is who she babysat for, and we learned that the apartment was totally secured, so we became very suspicious of him because he would probably have access to that apartment. And we immediately responded to interview him and in the upstairs apartment.
But when the police questioned the superintendent, his alibi is that he was at work the whole time. About the same time, detectives hear from the victim's mother about a possible suspect in a nearby town who had once sexually abused her daughter. It turns out that both the super and the other suspect have ironclad alibis, so it throws everything back to the apartment. What was the victim doing in Sue Levesque's apartment? And how come both doors were still locked? The answer was to be found in these traces of paranoia. Exhibit A, hairs and fibers. Investigators questioned Sue Levesque again, this time about anything unusual that may have happened the day of the murder. She was just leaving for work when she saw a guy quickly turn away. It aroused her suspicions. She thought to herself, this is the guy who's been breaking into my apartment. She just convinced herself she was being ridiculous when she drove past his car a moment later and noticed it was empty. That's why she memorized the license plate number. Police traced the car to a Barney Lomage. Lomage lives in the basement flat at his mother's. When police question him, he flatly denies his car has been in front of the victim's building at any time during the day.
They were gone for approximately 20 minutes. We then asked, was it a white MGB? And they said yes. Is it the right license number? Yes. We said, could you go back and set up surveillance on him?
We wanted to keep track of him. We wanted to know what his whereabouts were at all times. We wanted to see where he was going to lead us to. We knew nothing about Barney Lomage other than the information that Sue Levesque had given us.
Police hustled back just in time to catch Lomage doing something suspicious.
I went to the manhole, looked down it with my flashlight, and I could see a knife lying in the bottom. The manhole cover was removed. I climbed down inside, photographed it, and collected the knife from the sewer.
The curious thing about this particular knife is that it's a bread and butter knife. So when we collected it, we really didn't know what it was, how it was connected to the scene at that particular time.
Why was he ditching a butter knife? The victim hadn't been stabbed. The ident unit was baffled. Meanwhile, detectives get a break.
We then went back in and commenced interviewing the superintendent again, and I can recall saying to him, by the way, do you know Barney Lamage? And he said, no, I don't. And then he thought for a minute, and he said, Barney, just a minute. And he went out to, I believe, his kitchen area, and he got his record book. And he says, yeah, here he is right here, Barney Lamage. He used to live here. And we said, oh, that's interesting. Where did he live? And he said, in the apartment where the murder occurred.
When questioned by police, Lomage swears he spent the day filling out applications at an employment office 30 kilometers away. He gives officers the name of the woman he dealt with. Police drive the route 5 totally different ways to see if it's possible to fill out the application and still have time to commit the murder. It is. So all these pieces were fitting together. Barney Lomage is now their strongest suspect. Police scrutinize his every move.
And now he's going into a bush riding with 2 other young females on horses. So we kept close surveillance, as close as we could on him. We were concerned that, oh, we're going to be in trouble if they don't come out of that bush all intact. As soon as he came out of that stable, he got in his car and left. He went a very short distance down the road, and we asked our surveillance team to do a rolling stop with him. Bob and I approached the car, and he was immediately arrested for first-degree murder.
But when detectives meet with the chief prosecutor, he's concerned that their evidence on Barney Lomage is woefully thin. Police get a search warrant to check out Lomage's apartment. They find silverware whose pattern matches the butter knife he dropped in the sewer, and a roll of film. In situations like this, the police always hope it'll contain photos of the victim and implicate the suspect. But the photos turn out to be from a party. None of the pictures show even a trace of Carol Ann Jennings, Sue Levesque, or Barney Lomage. When police interview the tenant who lived in the apartment before Sue Levesque, she recalls her strange dream and her missing camera. It turns out the photos from the camera in Lomage's room are ones she took of a party she attended. Obviously, it hadn't been a dream. But that only proves he was in the apartment a year ago. Investigators needed to prove that Barney Lomage was with Carol Ann Jennings in Sue Levesque's apartment on the day of the murder. The very foundation of forensic science is based on a theory that every criminal will always take something away from the scene of a crime and leave something behind, even if it's only a trace.
The fingerprints that were useful for us in this investigation were the fingerprints of our deceased on the textbooks that were in the bedroom.
Investigators theorize that the victim must have seized the books as the only possible weapon to defend herself against her attacker.
And we also dusted a part of the balcony at this residence, the front balcony, and found a footprint. And that footprint, of course, was useful because that was later identified as being made by the shoe of our accused.
Police also obtained hair samples from Barney Lomage.
What you see is one of the hairs from our accused, and this was found present on the bedclothes that were present. As you can see from the convoluted nature of the hair ending here, this is the root end. This is what we would term a ribbon root. And it indicates that the hair was in the active growth phase at the time it was pulled from the scalp. And in fact, it allows us to say that this was forcefully removed.
But investigators still have a problem. because a good defense lawyer could argue that Barney Lomage's hairs and footprints were found in the apartment because he used to live there. Trace evidence can be used by either side. Investigators need to find trace evidence connecting Barney Lomage, his apartment, his car, the victim, and Sue Levesque's apartment. In this case, the painstaking and arduous process is a two-way street.
Some cases involve a considerable amount of interplay between ourselves and the investigators. We develop some evidence, we relate our findings to them, and they in turn consider the meaning of this evidence and can it possibly lead to other findings with respect to fibers or hairs. As an example, in this case, we surfaced within the apartment where the murder occurred, we surfaced a number of red fibers. They were present on the bedclothes, they were present on the deceased, and yet within the apartment there was no source for these fibers.
Investigators get another search warrant and obtain a number of articles from the accused bedroom. One of the articles is Barney Lomage's red dressing gown.
Once we had established or mounted some of these fibers from the dressing gown and started comparing them with the fibers that appeared at the scene, we were able to say that, yes, they are the same.
But forensic investigators have a saying: you can never have too much evidence. As the trial date approaches, Jim Crocker produces a chart with more than 150 samples that identify various kinds of trace evidence: hair and numerous fibers from the murder scene, Lomage's car, and his apartment. Police surmise Barney had been stalking Carol Ann. From his car, he could track her movements as she came down from babysitting in the Supers' apartment to go back home. On the morning in question, he waited till Sue Levesque had left for work and broke into her apartment. He replaced the jar where he thought it had been. Then he waited just inside the door until he heard Carol Ann in the hall. He grabbed her and pulled her into the apartment. She struggled. He forced her into the bedroom, where he tried to get her onto the bed. She tried to fight him off with whatever was nearby. She grabbed Sue Levesque's books. Finally, he forced her into the bathroom and strangled her with the bra. Then he straightened the books and was going to straighten the rest of the apartment when he heard a siren. He quickly relocked the front door and gently let the stick fall back into place. Now we know how he got out. The question is how he got in. At the trial, Dennis Cullen demonstrated how he thought it was done.
And you reach in and slide the chain up using the knife, and you're in.
When the ident officer did it in court, the jury gasped.
We had a witness tell us that as a 6-year-old, she was sexually assaulted by Lomage. As a 6-year-old, this happened. So, I mean, his evilness went back that far.
In the end, Barney Lomage was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
And here's a girl that was 15 years old. She lived a very short life. She was just an average teenager. If that doesn't motivate you to do your job well, then nothing will.
And what about Sue Levesque, the young woman who had to wrestle with her own paranoia?
She thought it unusual enough to write down the license number. Had she not done that, this case would have been much more difficult, if not unsolvable.
She provided us with a ton of forensic evidence in this case because of the fact that she was able to point us in the right direction so quickly.
And she was a witness of witnesses. She really was fantastic.
Barney Lomage might have become a serial murderer, but he didn't, thanks to a great investigative team, a dream witness, and a crack forensic scientist who used a strand of fiber to give Barney enough rope to hang himself.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. What makes forensic science so powerful is that sometimes it's the little things that end up being so big in an investigation. These are the cases that stay etched in the scientist's memory and documented in their scrapbook. A year after Alan Malloy is charged with theft and possession, he is hired as a part-time maintenance man. A week later, he's found by the safe in the administration office and fired by the head caretaker. Two weeks later, the head caretaker's kid brother, John Mitchell, is working what would have been Malloy's shift, trying to earn extra cash for Christmas. Working alongside him is Wesley Carpenter, who studied urban and regional planning at university before being forced to quit due to financial difficulties. Because of his interest in urban issues, he volunteers at the community center. This is only his second Saturday helping out. Bernie Eves, a caretaker at the center, arrives for his evening shift. He looks for John and Wesley, but can't find them anywhere. In the executive office, he finds John's coat. Confused, he phones the head caretaker, John's older brother, but ends up speaking to his wife. She's positive John is working the afternoon shift. He tells her to hang on, and he'll look again. This time, in the boiler room, he finds John. There was so much blood, Eves later testifies that he flipped out. He went into shock and just wanted to get the hell out of there. The police are called to the scene. A purplish fluid from punctured air conditioning drums is oozing onto the floor and mixing with blood. John and Wesley are dead, and they'd been blasted with some kind of a weapon. We pick up the story with the investigating officer.
When we first enter, we have this massive amount of blood. We have the purplish liquid on the floor, and I'm not close enough to the bodies at that point to tell that they have been shot. I can see the trauma to the head, and from a distance of the doorway, is all this blood from these head wounds? Eventually, we made our way to the bodies, and obviously up close and examined the bodies. You can see the gaping wounds on either side of the chest cavity, laterally, left and right. Both of them were shot the same way.
Even though it's 2 in the morning, Detective Strathdee calls his favorite firearms expert, Finn Nielsen. He tells Finn he needs some help.
When my phone rings at 2 in the morning and everybody's home, then I know it must be the police probably that are calling me about something. We get called out relatively routinely. In fact, I made it the practice of having my home number on my business cards because as far as I'm concerned with the job we do, we should be available at any time.
Finn works at the Center of Forensic Science, where they have an extensive gun library. Most of these guns have been confiscated in crimes and turned over to the firearms section after the court case. It's particularly useful in no-gun cases. That is, crimes committed with a gun which cannot be found at the scene.
There were these 2 dead bodies lying there, and to me they had obviously been shot. One of them, he was lying on his back, and there was damage to the front of his sweater. And of course, he was lying in a huge pool of blood, so if he hadn't been shot, he'd been stabbed with something pretty heavy. I thought he'd been shot. And also, of course, I saw the cartridge cases lying on the floor, which, don't ask me why, but they hadn't picked up and taken with them, which was okay with me.
When it comes to cartridges or bullets, Finn has a photographic memory. He can tell immediately the 300 gauge cartridge at the scene is for a rifle. But it's such a common cartridge, it could have come from any number of rifles. But after 25 years as a firearms expert, Finn Nielsen gets a flash of forensic intuition. He picks up a piece of wood. It means nothing to the ident unit. It means nothing to the investigating officer. In fact, no one would have even bothered to collect it. But Finn senses it's important, though he just can't figure out why. An unassuming splinter of wood. Exhibit A. The difference between someone getting away scot-free or being convicted of murder. Though it was well past 3 in the morning, Finn told investigators to meet him back at the Center of Forensic Science.
The little light went on, you know, it's in your head, and I said to the detectives, I said, I think I know what kind of gun you're looking for. So they said, really? You know, expressions of disbelief and so on, but I was pretty sure I knew what it was. That's what it looks like. Just your average normal hunting rifle. And the dimensions of it and everything else, it just yelled Savage 99 at me.
That was a crucial piece because the investigation then went to, are there any .300 Savage caliber rifles stolen in this area? Well, within the preceding week, there had been one reported to the Metropolitan Toronto Police, and it was within 6 blocks of the community center where the break-in had occurred. The .300 Savage rifle was one of 3 weapons that were stolen from the house. So the investigation at that point turned to, let's solve the break-in.
Because young criminals are proud of themselves when they steal guns, they brag about it to their friends. That's how detectives got to the thief. Police put Terry King under surveillance. King, as police later learn, comes from a notorious family who took great pride in who committed the most brutal criminal act. Terry King's father had been convicted of manslaughter. In another murder, Terry King's uncle had been convicted of manslaughter. And a first cousin was convicted of killing a policeman's son. Terry King himself had been convicted of armed robbery, jailed and prohibited from possessing a firearm for 5 years. police decided to swoop down and pick up Terry King and Alan Malloy. The pair are questioned separately. When Terry King is confronted with what the police already know, he promises to lead them to the rifle, if he is allowed to talk to his girlfriend first. He is told they can speak privately, but that police will be watching.
They chat and chat and chat. And all of a sudden, she steps back from him and she starts laughing. They complete their conversation. She comes out, take her to another room. And I said, could you tell me what caused the laughter? And her response to me was that he asked her, would she wait 25 years for him? And that's when she stood back and laughed.
In crimes committed by partners, it's common if the partners get caught to see them suddenly turn on each other. You know, no honor among thieves. That's what happened here. According to Alan Malloy, ever since he'd been fired at the community center, he'd been itching to get back. The plan was to tape a side door open and stash the tools so that he and Terry King could sneak back in later that afternoon. They smoked a joint in the stairwell, then headed for the safe. John instantly recognized Malloy and knew that he had been fired from the center and why. Wesley told the pair they weren't supposed to be there. According to Malloy, he didn't know about the gun and was scared about what King planned to do. King told him that he was just going to tie them up. Malloy said, let's get out of here, and King said, F off. Then King marched them down to the boiler room. According to Malloy, he never went into the boiler room. According to Malloy, he wanted to take off, but he didn't. He was scared of King. So we went upstairs and watched King try to break into the safe. According to Terry King, yeah, they'd had robbery on their minds. They'd gone there in the afternoon. They'd smoked a joint, but it was Malloy who tried to break into the safe. He'd gotten scared when John recognized Malloy. Then together, they took the two caretakers downstairs. In King's version, Malloy didn't wait outside the boiler room at all. When Wesley tried to get the gun away from Malloy, he panicked. Wesley tried to hide behind the boiler. King promised him if he came out, he wouldn't hurt him. According to King, Malloy heard heavy breathing coming from John and started to jump on the victim's head. According to King, Malloy was anxious to go back upstairs. After about 10 minutes, they left and headed to King's girlfriend's place. Two different tales. Meanwhile, Finn Nielsen uses the comparison microscope to match the cartridges from the murder weapon to the rifle recovered from Terry King. Intuition is one thing, proof is another. They match. Sure enough, the Savage 99 is the murder weapon. But whose finger had been on the trigger? With no eyewitness and the court date rapidly approaching, another branch of forensics now comes into play. After police arrested King and Malloy, they also got a search warrant to seize the clothes they had been wearing on the day of the murder. The clothes are sent to the biology lab at the Center of Forensic Science to check for blood from the crime scene. These days, DNA profiling is the criminal investigative technique of the century. But this case predated DNA. At the time of the crime, the blood classification system in use was called ABO. Red blood cells contain antigens, substances responsible for the production of antibodies to combat infection and disease in the body. The presence or absence of two of these antigens, which are called A and B, give us our four distinct human blood groups: A, B, O, and AB. Each human being belongs to one of these groups. In the United States and Canada, for example, the percentages are approximately A, 40%, B, 10%, O, 45%, AB, 5%. So, for instance, if a murder victim has type O blood and a suspect type A, and traces of O are found on the suspect's clothing, it can go a long way to linking the suspect to murder. Everyone is also divided into two groups, Rh positive and Rh negative. By factoring in these and other blood features, the accuracy of a suspect being guilty are on the order of 3,000 to 1. Meager compared with DNA profiling, where the figures can be 1 billion to 1, but still enough to convict.
And the unknown stains that we found on clothing from Mr. Malloy and Mr. King, we subjected those to typing analyses, and we established whether there was a connection, if you like, between what was present on their clothing and the reference samples from the victims. At the time of trial, I testified that the blood on Mr. King's shirt was consistent with having originated from the victims, all right, based on the ABO type and the GM type that I obtained.
Keith Kelder said tests on Malloy's clothing failed to find any blood that could match that of the two murdered men. But how did King get blood on his clothes?
And the piece of wood was a piece broken off right in here. Because you see the stock, it's held up on with a bolt that comes up through the middle when there's a hole drilled in it. And that weakens it a little bit. So if you strike this hide against something, it'll break and shatter. But they've taken the pieces with them and left this little piece there. Lucky for us, really.
If you know anything about guns, I mean, this .300 Savage would bring down an elephant. And then the trauma to the head. It didn't happen with one blow. It happened with 20 blows. You know, that idea. And you'd hear the fracturing of the skull. You'd hear it. You'd hear bones breaking.
Expertise is not just about the gun or the bullet, but putting the whole picture together. When Finn finally assembles the butt of the rifle, all the pieces finally fall into place. The jury deliberated for an hour and a half. Their verdict? Malloy was found not guilty. but he was charged with break and enter, an accessory after the fact with murder. He was given 9 months.
My impression of Malloy's involvement in this matter was a follower and a disciple of Terry King. He liked King's style, this evil person. He liked that. I don't think he was necessarily that way, but he liked to follow in the footsteps.
King was sentenced with 2 counts of first-degree murder and therefore was given life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 25 years.
Psychopath, devoid of emotion, remorse, nothing. You know, he didn't say these words, but it was, well, they shouldn't have been there. That was the inference. They shouldn't have been there.
The object of this botched robbery, the safe, that King and Malloy so desperately wanted to crack and never did, contained only $51.
We all lose lovers and friends over the years, and family, and through routine causes. But when you take that loss and that tragedy, and it's caused by a Terry King, as you say, an evil person, who has taken the life of your son to get $50. Yeah, it hurts to try and discuss that with a family member and make some sense of it. You can't, it's impossible.
It gave Bob Strasty a lead where he didn't have one before, because you had 2 strangers who killed 2 strangers. And where do you start? You know, nobody dropped the wallet at the scene or anything else helpful like that, so it's pretty tough.
Finn Nielsen was like Exhibit A splinter in the side of King and Malloy.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Imagine a crime-fighting team made up of a concerned doctor, an undercover ex-biker, and a shy biochemist. Yet this unlikely trio is what it would take to try and stop an accused murderer. Exhibit A, the DNA of a virus. It started with a love story. Jennifer Anderson was invited to a dinner party where her cousin introduced her to the guest of honor, Charles Syanga. Charles was smitten with her immediately. Jennifer was a recent university graduate back from years of travel, now managing a clothing boutique. Charles Syanga was a refugee from Uganda, a law student who narrowly escaped the repressive regime there. He fled to Canada, where he had enrolled at McMaster University and studied political science. At the time, the Canadian job market was proving inhospitable, and Syanga was almost penniless. But Syanga was successful in another field. He could make himself irresistible to women. Though Jennifer Anderson was not given to casual sexual affairs, the day after she met Syanga, she went to bed with him. He did not wear a condom, but she was not concerned. She was taking the pill. AIDS only happened to gay men or IV drug users, so everyone thought. It was 1986. AIDS was still a relatively new disease. There was no cure. Doctors believed that it was almost 100% fatal. The result was often hysteria. This was the spacesuit era, when nurses and doctors, even some clergy, wore gloves, masks, and gowns to approach anyone suspected of having AIDS. Over the next year, Jennifer's health was fine, except for rather frequent colds and flu. But Syanga was suffering from excruciating headaches. She urged him to see a doctor. The doctor found he had swollen lymph glands, indicating the presence of an infection. Syanga conceded to her he probably had the AIDS virus. Before coming to Canada, he had had an affair with a prostitute who worked the university bars. Supposedly, he had even fathered her child. At that point, Uganda had the highest concentration of AIDS in the world. 25% of all sexually active adults had the virus. Both the prostitute and the child had died of AIDS. Even after his tests came back confirming he had AIDS, Syanga continued to have sex with Jennifer Anderson. He never told her about the tests, and he never wore a condom. Around this time, Syanga and a fellow Ugandan borrowed money from friends and opened the African shop. Syanga was knowledgeable about the paintings and artifacts, and he had the passion of a salesman. Jennifer's ardor was cooling towards Syanga, because he would make a date for Friday and show up Saturday or not at all. One day, Jennifer ran into a friend of her cousin's, Linda Booker. When Linda casually mentioned she was also having an affair with Syanga, it was the final straw. Jennifer stopped calling. Syanga never seemed to notice. Shortly after this, Jennifer went to give blood. The Red Cross, which had been screening blood since 1985, sent her a letter saying that her blood had been rejected. She was advised to visit her family doctor. When her doctor opened the letter, he gasped and said, "Oh dear, I have bad news. You're HIV positive. You better not have sex with anyone. You are a walking time bomb waiting to go off." From what little she knew about AIDS, she expected to die within weeks. She was 26, single, the beloved daughter of a well-to-do family, and she just tried to adjust to the knowledge that her life was over. It was devastating. Jennifer went looking for a female doctor. That's how she came to Dr. Cheryl Wagner, one of the few women in 1988 treating AIDS.
At this point, I had a lot of experience with HIV, but most of my practice for the previous 5 years had been with gay men. So she was, I believe, actually the first woman I saw with HIV. She had just met this man, and she was so concerned that she may have infected him.
5 days later, Linda Booker also went to see Dr. Wagner. She also tested positive for the AIDS virus, and the same man was also responsible, Charles Syanga. So Linda wrote him a letter clearly stating that both she and Jennifer had tested positive, and because of the high incidence of AIDS in Uganda and your promiscuous behavior, it is virtually 100% certain that you too are a carrier of the AIDS virus. The letter ended with the ultimatum that if Syanga didn't cooperate and reveal the names of his sexual partners so they could be contacted by an anonymous third party, she would allow her doctor to report him to the public health authorities. He didn't respond. Cheryl Wagner notified public health, and a nurse was dispatched to tell Syanga that he was obliged to be tested. He was found to be HIV positive and instructed not to have unprotected sex. As he often did with members of the health community, Syanga assured her that he always practiced safe sex, and that besides, these days he was celibate. A year later, a third woman arrived in Dr. Wagner's office. She too was HIV positive. And again, her partner was Charles Syanga.
At that point, I almost fell off my chair because this was 1 year later, This was clearly a new infection. This was a man who I knew had been counseled, who I knew knew his HIV positive status. I think as soon as she walked out of the door, I was on the phone to public health and asked to speak to the medical officer of health for Toronto.
She persuaded the health authorities to issue a rare Section 22, forbidding Syanga from having sex at all. Francine Dalton, woman number 3, had met Syanga at a rock concert. She found him very considerate. The first time they had sex, she insisted he wear a condom. He agreed, then pulled it off right before he entered her, even though he knew he was infected and that he'd already infected 2 other women. Gradually, the relationship began to take on a familiar pattern. Syanga would make dates and show up late or not at all. Soon, there was a 4th woman. What would it take to stop this man? Amazing as it seems, what Syanga was doing, namely infecting women with a fatal virus, was not a crime in Canada. The reason? In a society of sexually active adults, it was virtually impossible to prove that one person, and one person only, was the source of a sexually transmitted disease. Around this time, Cheryl Wagner was following a case in Florida where a dentist was being sued by his patients for giving them AIDS.
The scientists had shown that the virus that he had was genetically similar to the virus in his patients, proving that his patients had acquired the HIV virus from him.
Cheryl Wagner wondered, could something similar be done in this case? Enter an unlikely hero. Dr. Michael Montpetit, 31, had recently joined the Federal Center for AIDS. He jumped at the chance to match the DNA of Synyanga's virus to the infected women. Little did Montpetit know that for the next 2 years, this case would dominate his life, invade his solitude, and thrust him into the media spotlight.
The women decided that they were, at this point, frustrated enough with the public health process and the lack of protection that public health had given them, that they were ready to sort of take this very tentative foray into the criminal side of the investigation.
But if there was to be a trial, the police would have to gather evidence. The assignment was given to Inspector Terry Hall, a legend in the OPP for his courage working undercover with bike gangs. The women would have to reveal every intimate detail of every sexual encounter with Syanga and any other lover over the past year and a half.
Syanga was just like a biker, except he didn't have a bike. In these kind of interviews, you have to get into very explicit details with these women as to the actual act that took place and every act that they had performed with the man. And it's very, very difficult for them to be interviewed and to discuss that sort of thing.
One of the first women Terry went to interview was Joan Estrada. Joan was a star athlete from a financially strapped family. She'd always dreamed of traveling to exotic places, but money was an obstacle. Syanga seemed the next best thing. They dated a few times. Then he took her to his place. He told her that he rarely dated and that she was special. Joan trusted him. After all, he'd attended a Roman Catholic seminary in Uganda and told her he considered becoming a priest. He promised, because she was special, he would use a condom. He didn't. Within weeks, she developed a rash over her whole body, lost 15 pounds, and couldn't even summon up enough energy to get out of bed. Eventually, it passed. A year later, she found out she was HIV positive. She wanted to die at once to avoid the shame of people learning of her condition.
Your victims are in homicide are dead. And now I'm dealing with an investigation where my victims are alive but dying before your eyes, as you do your investigation. And it's not like a bleeding knife wound. It's a long, slow death.
Soon there was a fifth victim, Nancy Gauthier, a single mother. Then a sixth, Danielle Fitzgerald, who had been date raped by Syanga. He had insisted, even though she said no, that she wanted it. Michael Montpetit worked for months trying to identify the DNA of the women's virus. It was like hitting a wall with no way over or through it.
It was very frustrating time after time to see my positive controls work beautifully, my negative controls not show anything as they should, and my samples not show anything at all. And that was very frustrating.
Montpetit was trying to replicate the technique used in Florida, but it just wasn't yielding results. Without his evidence, there could be no case against Syanga. A year went by. During this time, the women went back and forth about whether they would testify. It was very difficult for them because none of the women's parents knew that they were HIV positive. So the idea of testifying in a public trial was terrifying.
I was concerned what that would do to their emotional health and also their physical health, because stress can play havoc with the immune system.
Montpetit had been proceeding on the assumption that Synyanga's AIDS virus was a subtype B, a North American strain, like the Florida dentists. But given that nothing was working, he decided to try something radically different, and it worked. Not only was Synyanga's virus different than the dentist, it was an African subtype A, a strain never before seen in North America. At Synyanga's preliminary trial in February 1992, a big issue was the question of consent. The women had consented to having sex. They hadn't consented to being infected with a deadly disease. But would that distinction hold up in court? The star witness was Michael Montpetit.
The reactions from all the women indicated that all of them shared HIV subtype A, which is not commonly found in North America. And that was a first very strong indication that these women were all infected from a common source.
The women gave very moving testimony about the catastrophic effects on their lives and dreams from being infected with AIDS by Syanga. Their health was failing. They were isolated by despair and the stigma of AIDS. Joan was so suicidal, Dr. Wagner and others worried about her. The judge in the preliminary trial allowed 2 charges to stand: sexual assault and gross negligence causing bodily harm. But Montpetit had yet to prove that Syanga was the source of the women's infection, and that would prove its own incredible adventure. All he had left of Synyanga's blood was enough for 2 more tests. There was no chance of getting any more. It was before defendants had to provide blood samples. Montpetit was nervous about using up what was left of Synyanga's original blood sample. He'd heard about a method developed by 2 Australian scientists to dilute such samples to produce volumes of testable material. But though he could locate the microscopic molecules in the lab, he couldn't find the 2 scientists. One of the prosecutors was convinced that Terry Hall could do anything. So he asked the OPP investigator to find the Australians. Hall did just that in a couple of hours.
Using the new technology, instead of having enough for 2 or 3 tests on Mr. Synyanga's sample, I had enough for several hundred tests.
The Australian technique worked. It amplified the sample 400 times. Meanwhile, the AIDS virus was further insinuating itself into the women's immune systems. They were getting sicker. By this time, Syanga had met and married Connie Neal, who felt that he was being victimized by the women and was determined to stand by him. Finally, Montpetit could attempt a comparison between the DNA of Synyanga's virus and that of the infected women. The day he discovered that the DNA profiles matched was one he'd never forget.
I was ecstatic. I bounced around the laboratory for an entire afternoon when I took the picture and saw the material present on the gel.
By June 1993, the trial was ready to proceed. The judge, Dougal McDermott, had a habit of making his judicial notes directly into his computer. Michael Montpetit testified that the DNA of the women's HIV was consistent with one another and with the accused, Charles Syanga. The conclusion? One person, and only one person, was responsible for their being infected with AIDS, Charles Syanga. All the women testified about the devastating effect of what Charles Syanga had done to them. But Joan Estrada's was particularly moving. I always wanted to have children. Now I can't. I'm 25 years old, and this should be the prime of my life. And what do I have to face? Death. Look at me, damn you. Are you proud of yourself? Syanga never looked up. The question on everyone's mind was, why did Syanga do it? Why did he continue to have unprotected sex with women after he knew he had AIDS?
He had a capacity to charm even the public health nurse who was seeing him, even the doctors who were seeing him. But underneath that, there was somebody who I felt all along was cold, calculating, and not confused about HIV. This was a smart man. This was a man with 4 or 5 years of legal training himself. I felt he knew exactly what he was doing. And just didn't care.
His lawyer at first argued that HIV didn't cause AIDS and that Syanga was suffering post-traumatic shock due to the trauma of his Ugandan university days.
With the evidence, the way it was presented, the evidence was there was no doubt that he infected these women. There was no doubt that he knowingly infected these women, in my mind, and from the evidence that was presented. So I was very confident of a conviction.
The judge said he would consider this decision and render it in a few weeks. He didn't have a few weeks. Exactly 13 days later, Charles Syanga died of meningitis, a treatable disease. Justice McDermott had already written 128 pages of his decision. He simply deleted the file.
For the women, it was terribly frustrating because this was typical of Charles Syanga. He was always the man who would call up and say he'd be there on the weekend and then never show up. For them, it felt like once again he had done it to them. He had missed his final date.
This man didn't get his just due. He took the easy way out.
The women were left trying to deal with their shattered lives, afraid of having intimate relationships for fear of infecting partners. Words can barely describe their isolated and fragile existence. Francine Dalton recently died of AIDS. Cheryl Wagner cared for her up until the end. Terry Hall held her hand as she went into her final coma. More than a dozen other women who were infected by Syanga have come forward since the trial. 2 others died of AIDS.
This case brought 2 things to me. One is a deep appreciation for how easy it is to become engrossed in small details and to dissociate oneself from the ramifications of one's science. The other is how dedicated people really put their lives into what they do, and how, in some ways, nobody but them can appreciate how much time and effort and heartache they invest into these projects.
The Syanga case was unique in so many ways, not the least of which is that there may never be another case where the infection so clearly came from one and only one person. There is still no law in Canada to prevent what Syanga did. The stories in Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.